well, I guess we can go ahead and get rolling. It's like a smaller group today. That's cool. The faithful. Today we're taking a bit of a turn in what we've been looking at. We're turning to a totally different kind of psalm than we've been looking at, namely the Psalms of Lament, or the Psalms of Protest or Complaint. We'll see how this contrast, or the psalm that we're looking at today, that things emerge about it in contrast, especially to the particular psalms we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks. I hope that that'll create some nice comparison and contrast for us. But in general, this will be quite a lurch and dip into a totally different kind of psalm than we've seen so far. But that said, an important introduction to lament in the Psalms would be to note that it is the most common and frequent kind of psalm in the Psalter. There are more psalms of lament than there are of praise or of thanksgiving. And this draws sort of odd attention to the title of the Psalms in Hebrew. Praises is what they're called, technically in Hebrew. And I think praises is sort of what the book of Psalms is known as well, rather than a book of lament. And I wouldn't call it a book of lament, but the fact that there are more psalms of lament than there are of any other type, it does provoke our imagination about what the Psalter is as a whole, and what it means that the Psalms are called praises, and how we ought to sort of carry that title, and how we ought to approach the Psalms as such. Clearly, if they are praises, they're permeated with the very real, not even underside, but face of praise, what it really looks like most of the time to come to praise. Often we come to praise with our experiences of loneliness and abandonment and isolation and pain and suffering first on our mind. And our communities, whenever we praise, are full of that reality. There's never a moment when we're actually all in unison, fully oriented and celebrating, firmly founded in our current state. Our communities are full of so many diverse voices, even when we praise. And I think the fact that the Psalms are so full of lament perhaps points us to this reality, that they're always the primary language of prayer. Whereas praise is a primary kind of prayer, I think that the laments voice prayer in its truest form. So certainly if we started the class with the notion that the Psalms teach us how to pray, I would highlight that lament and protest in the Psalter is where they do it best. Because the prayers of lament are truly the most prayer-like psalms. They truly ask and cry out for help, whereas praise is prayer, but in a different way, in a way that, as we've seen, educates and involves the community and challenges. But the Psalms of Lament issue from a very different kind of place, a place of need and desperation, and so prayer itself becomes a completely different practice. And as we will see, one of the biggest shifts is that a lot of these prayers issue not from a community or from a public setting, but from loneliness and isolation. So this is a kind of prayer and a kind of piety and a kind of speech that represents the life of faith for individual persons as it often manifests. So, yeah, and I guess one other thing I'd call our attention to is I'd like to get to the psalm first and just kind of let it lead us into what lament looks like, rather than saying too much about it. But since we're coming right off of Psalm 104 last week, which y'all might remember, I just would like to sort of draw our attention to one major shift that is happening with the psalm that we'll be looking at today, and with many laments. In their voice as first-person prayers issuing from first-person experiences of pain and suffering, and often loneliness, the center of lament, the center of the world as constructed by a lament prayer, has shifted hugely from what we see in something like a praise psalm in Psalm 104. You remember in Psalm 104 how we talked about that way of constructing praise and kind of constructing an image of the world decentered humanity and made humanity sort of an image of just one thing in a great, complex, amazing system. Drew attention to all the other aspects of creation as just as, if not more important, right? So the drama of humans was sort of downplayed. And the drama of nurturing all of creation was upplayed, right? The Psalms of Lament are such a contrast, and they provide a very different kind of theology than that. Not necessarily in contradiction, but quite in tension. Because they draw such sustained, focused, clear attention to the plight of individuals and only that. And the Psalms of Lament then affirm a posture of sometimes making it all about you, I would say. And so it's a completely different outlook than that of Psalm 104, say, which is trying to shift a different focus and form our awareness of how it's not, how there's so much more going on than my or even human dramas. But the Psalms of Lament indulge in deep awareness of a personal reality, and they bring it to God as if it is the only reality. They have such a high view of a single person's experiences and pain, and they bring it to God as if it should be God's whole concern. So there's a complete and drastic shift. Y'all see that? Where, I mean, we'll see it especially in the Psalm, but to go from seeing human plights in that particular way of Psalm 104 to them being the whole focus of prayer, with no mention really of how this fits in elsewhere. I think, as we'll see, that's one of the ways that the Psalms of Lament best affirm the reality of what it's like for humans to suffer. When you're suffering, the last thing you need to know or want to hear is how it fits into the grander scheme, right? Or that it's not that significant compared to X or Y, or measuring, comparing pain, or putting it in proportion. I mean, this is a very traditional kind of rhetoric, even in the church, for dealing with pain and suffering, talking about how it measures up against other things, or bigger stories, or how much we have to be grateful for. Psalms of Lament couldn't be less interested. They're very raw about what it's like to be in pain and to be lonely, and they don't have much time for people who deny that reality in any way, including Psalm 104. They would just be, it's not for today. So that's the kind of tension the Psalms draw us into, is awareness of there's a time for these different ways of constructing the world and different ways of praying and praising. So the Psalms of Lament will give us a very different look than we saw the last couple of weeks. Y'all got handouts? Everybody got a handout of Psalm 6 in front of them? Okay, well, they're going around if you didn't. They're sitting around if you didn't. But let's go ahead and read the psalm together then, and see what jumps out to us, or what emerges, what it stirs up in us. And I'll read it. So this is Psalm 6. And this superscription here, that's all that it is. I won't read that, but those are just notes, like musical notes, and we don't really even know what they mean. They're historical notes that are for the musician or whoever's playing it to know what key to play it in or whatever. So Psalm 6. Yahweh, do not in your anger rebuke me. Do not in your wrath discipline me. Be gracious to me, Yahweh, for I am so weak. Heal me, Yahweh, for my body shakes in dismay. My very being is shaken with despair. And you, Yahweh, how long? Turn, Yahweh, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your commitment. For there is no memory of you in death. Who will confess you in Sheol? I have grown weary in my sighing. Every night I make my bed swim. With my tears I melt my mattress. My eye has wasted away from anger, grown weak because of all my attackers. Depart from me, all you who cause sorrow, because Yahweh has listened to the sound of my weeping. Yahweh has listened to my prayer for grace. Yahweh receives my prayer. All my enemies will be ashamed and will shake greatly in despair. They will turn and be put to shame instantly. So, what stands out to you about this prayer?
Well, it reminds me of Job.
That's interesting. Say more.
Well, this, just this utter despair. And this just totally wrapped up in, everything is lost, all, so on and so forth. And, really wanting God to step in. God
Right.
is really not too interested in stepping in.
Right, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
There seems to be a shift between 7 and 8 in terms of the direction of the song.
Yeah.
In terms of the 1 through 7, the psalmist is speaking directly to Yahweh, and then 8 to 10, there is a bit of hopefulness that's starting to seep in, and that the psalmist might be talking to other people about what Yahweh has done for him or her.
Absolutely, yeah, there's a clear shift in direction of speech there, right? At verse 8. Yeah, that's very important for how this psalm works, I think. Thank you.
I thought 4 and 5 were interesting. It seems like they're calling Yahweh to account, kind of.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Well, just kind of saying, hey, remember your commitments. And
Yeah.
like, there's no memory of you if I die, so don't let me die.
Right, yeah. So right there, I chose memory. You could also translate it something like remembrance. So what it's saying at that particular point is something like, it's provoking God, because the psalmist is trying to say, when people die, they're separated from you. And this is actually a different way of thinking about death than we have in the Christian tradition now. But the Old Testament, ancient Israelite religion involved a belief about this place, Sheol, this shadowy place that everyone went to, not just bad people or neutral people, but everyone. Death was a shadowy thing to happen. And that means your existence faded away and was separate from the God of the living. That's Yahweh. Yahweh is the God of the living.
That's the meaning of Sheol. What is Sheol?
Sheol is a place in the sort of cosmic geography of ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. Sheol is kind of ancient Israel's version of what people regarded as the underworld. So it's not really a hell, like we think of a torturous, punishing place for bad people, but it is sort of down, geographically speaking. It's under, but it's not really like all that bad. It's just nothing much at all. It's just dust. It's just
Limbo.
It's fadedness. It's shadow world. There's a sense of just complete, utter meaninglessness, and things have faded there. So the image of the God of life is that this is a God who maintains and sustains the living and carries their memory when they're dead. The image of death, then, is a separation from that. So life is highly regarded in ancient Israel. Death is seen as an end of life in many ways. And the belief in resurrection sort of emerges later in Israel's history as a theological innovation, the idea that this God of the living will restore the faithful to life. But in general, what we see in the Hebrew Bible, at least, is a different kind of view of life and death than we normally have. For them, life is bodies and breathing, and it's life, and death is the end of that. And that wasn't a theological problem for a lot of ancient Israelites. So what's happening here is a bargain going on, something like, if I die, who will remember you? Literally, who will be praising you? If my life goes away, how will your reputation be affected? How will people hear about you? Because your people just fade. Like, save me for your own sake, so that my voice can praise you. Because there's no remembrance of you in death. That's the point. And there's no confessing you in Sheol. Because confessing, and this is the greatest, confessing is like, it's a worship. There's no praising you. There's no proclaiming what you do. There's no what we've been seeing in the last two Psalms we looked at, right? No telling true stories about who you are. And this is really interesting because in death, in Sheol, the idea is you've lost your body, which is all of your life. It's a very embodied way of thinking about what it means to be a human. There's not a spirit. It's just, you're gone, you're faded. And for ancient Israelites, you need your body to confess and praise. It's not a cognitive activity. It's actually dancing around and making noise and physically showing that you believe these things. Whereas we think much more about verbal confession or thinking about the fact that God is in control. For them, there's a tight connection between being able to do these things with your body and your mouth and make noise. Death cancels that out. So there's a plea here. Come back to your comment. There's completely like a plea that God think twice about how this is going to affect God, right? This is an important moment for God to like step in, and it's a bargain, it's a ploy. I went into teaching there, sorry, but I thought that was pertinent maybe to understanding the verse there, like what's going on with death and life. Did that do justice to what you were talking about? What you're going
into? I think so.
Okay.
It's just not like a common way I've seen their kind of prayers interacting.
Absolutely, yeah.
With God.
That's like super key to what we're going to look at with how the prayer works today. So we'll put a pin in it and come back. Thank you. Yeah.
I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but you used the word employ.
Yeah, right.
And so does the psalmist think that God can be manipulated? Is that an essential part of God, that God can be
right?
Maybe manipulate it's too strong a word, but at least influenced.
I would say yes, and that this is one of the sort of joys that come from the Psalms that doesn't get represented well if we work from the categories of systematic or dogmatic theology in the church or orthodox theology. We end up at a place where this part of the Psalms, I think, can't emerge as well, because we start from presumptions about one of the words that we use a lot is, at least one of the technical words, something like immutability, right? Which means the unchangingness of God. God doesn't change God's mind. God doesn't change through time. Our prayers don't change God, they change us, right? We don't pray to make God do things he wasn't already going to do. We align ourselves to what God was going to do anyway. That's a popular way of thinking about prayer and about who God is. Popular for good reason. That's classical neo-orthodox theology. Like that's important dogmatic doctrine. However, the Bible offers a sort of a rhetoric that wrestles with that quite hard. When the Psalms pray, they're shameless about their efforts to manipulate God. And what's really interesting here about how they manipulate God, I'll talk more about in a second, but just to answer your question, like, they manipulate God, yes, but they do so by appealing to God's own character. They bargain with God using God's own self, and they involve God in the problem such that God's character is in question. Whether he'll act or not is a question of whether God will be known as a faithful God. So they don't bargain in a way that they trick or deceive or manipulate in a way that means they have power over God. Rather, they submit to God the one thing apparently God cares the most about, which is God's faithful reputation, or God's reputation for being faithful. But yes, it is a manipulative move, and it's something that I think we're not always comfortable thinking about in the church. The idea that there are ways we can actually make God act for us. But the Psalms pray this way over and over and over again. Remember your commitment. Deliver me for the sake of your name. That's a ploy. I mean, that's a call for God to act for a specific reason that's going to cost him if he doesn't. So that's a sort of short answer, sort of long answer, but yes. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Other things that stand out about this prayer, y'all? Yeah.
And then it follows with verse 8 and 9 with the assumption, well, he said, God has listened to my prayer, right? It's happened, and you will be,
right?
You will, my enemies will suffer consequences, whatever they will. And it is just assumption,
Right.
He knows that it will happen,
Right.
He or she who are speaking this knows that they will be punished.
Right.
Let's say, trying to God and saying, I heard it and told my enemies, so it must happen.
That's very interesting. Yeah, we'll get to that section, and we'll consider whether there are a couple ways of reading that. There's the idea that someone that the psalmist has experienced an answer and turned and said that in verse 8, or this is sort of a rhetorical move in the prayer to call God to act in the most desperate of ways by literally announcing that God has and will act and pulling God into it in that way. But we'll see what we think. What else emerges for you? Yeah.
To me, it almost sounds like what we hear Islamic extremists say.
Like what?
Oh, it's kind of violent, and the part about anger and God's gonna shame those my enemies, and I mean it sounds very extreme in a way.
Yes. I think you've raised something very important and a very sensitive issue, especially for modern faith communities. But a very important way that the Psalms, I think, can help us formulate a mature spirituality. The Psalms do not shy away from the kind of language you have in verse 10 or verse 8, that whole section about enemies. In Christian communities, we place a lot of emphasis on love for enemies, obviously, which is our ethic, of course. But we often, I think, we've learned that rhetoric apart from the rhetoric of Old Testament spirituality, which teaches us that there's a very good and proper place for raw feelings about enemies, and for entrusting those feelings, those hatreds, to God. Which my short response to this particular, like verse 10, and even verses as terrible as Psalm 137, which literally prays that this person's enemies' babies will have their heads dashed against rocks, and prays that God will see it done. Unimaginable horror is in that text, and yet it is our canonical model of a prayer against an oppressor. It's extremely violent in that case. In this case, you may say equally violent in the sense that that we're wishing on anyone shame and terror. And yet the Psalms make a house for this kind of a feeling and this kind of expression. And I would just say, as a bottom line about those kinds of texts, the sort of fundamental, I think, suggestion on the part of the Psalms about how we articulate those feelings, and that we should, and that we can, is that when we do, it's prayer that we're doing. So we don't militarize then after praying this prayer. We've entrusted this to God. That's the difference in what you're describing. Extremist groups that pray for their enemies to be killed and then go and kill them are not trusting in God to do the job. It's functional atheism in the sense that the prayer is just an announcement of what they would see done. The faith in this prayer is that God can make a home for this anger to its extremes, for the depth of human emotion about enemies and for those who have made one's life miserable. Truly, this psalmist is clearly alone and isolated and oppressed and made to be sad. In verse 8, the Psalms make a place for the fact that this person really does want their enemies to be put down and to be ashamed. And to shake greatly in despair is the same wording as what happens in verse 3 to the psalmist. The idea is that my body is shaking and I wish it on my oppressors. I wish they would be terrified. I wish they would have to feel what I feel. And that call, the Psalms are hospitable to. But again, I would underline, this is a prayer. And at the end of the day, what's being done is, let this be done. It's being given over to God, that it will be. And it's God's choice to deal with them as God will. The Psalms do not take it into their hands at any point. They don't bless the hands of the one who will now go and avenge the psalmist. They bless God and leave it to God to decide. And yet this rhetoric lasts, right? So there's that tension.
Right.
It's valid. What will God do with it? It's up to God. And that's the faith of the Psalms of Lament, that they trust. The way I love that a scholar named Walter Brueggemann said it, they trust God with their most precious hatreds. That you can trust God with your most precious hatreds, I think, is the gospel of these songs. That there's a place for them, and that they're real and valid and good, and that God is wise enough to take care of those very extreme emotions that the life of faith really has. Anything else that anybody want to share? Anything that stood out to them about this psalm or emerged for them?
Well, I would just say that it looks like this is pointing out to God how He can produce a desirable result, and giving him some good instruction.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. To put it plainly, I totally agree with you, and I think that this represents, one of the reasons I've chosen this is I think it represents some of the basics of the Psalms of Lament very well. And one of the things the Psalms of Lament do routinely, first, they presume that God needs to be told what's going on in our lives. I mean, this is just a basic presumption of this psalmist, right? And it's something I think that Christian communities today don't take for granted because of some of those classical theological ideas we were talking about a little while ago. We talked about immutability, the idea that God doesn't change or respond to things in that sense, that God doesn't change God's mind. But there's also this other driving idea, I think, present in a lot of minds in the church and outside of it, that God knows everything, right? That God is all-knowing, that God knows all our thoughts, that God knows our situations, that God knows what's going on. This psalm does not presume that God knows what's going on. It doesn't sit and wait for God to act. There's a sense, and how this strikes you, this might strike some of you differently than others, the idea that the Psalms take a sort of different approach to this idea of how much God knows. But I think the Psalms suggest that God may know what's going on in the world, but there's a big difference between knowing what's going on and hearing the voice of someone from their perspective about what's going on for them. And the Psalms of Lament take it upon themselves to say, God, there are things that you don't know that you need to be aware of, because if you were aware of them, you would be acting, right? That's the implication. The Psalms of Lament seem to think, the situation I'm in does not reflect the reality of the God that I call God. And if you are who you say you are, God, you're going to do something about this situation. So there is a presumption that God doesn't know, and that God needs to be told. They first tell God about the situation, and then presume that that matters, to tell God that there's an effect that's going to come about through prayer. And I think some of our classical theological ideas that are kind of generally understood, like God knows everything, can sometimes cloud, get in the way of our life of faith, the real life of faith, because they bear down on us this idea that God already knows everything. There's no real point in like telling God about anything, and it kind of kills the whole purpose of prayer if you follow it far enough. Why in the heck would we ever tell God about our lives? Why would we waste our time on that? God knows, and God probably already knows what he's going to do about it, and God already probably has opinions about the situation, and just assume all this, and it's not a relational being that we're talking about.
This is very passive.
Absolutely, yeah, right. Like everything's just going to work the way it will, and we just need to get on board. The Psalms of Lament couldn't be more bold about the idea that our perspective, that our experience, that what we feel or think about certain situations and how they're panning out matters to God. And that God's perspective on how things ought to go can and will be altered by what we tell God about situations we're in. This, I think, is different than what normally gets said about prayer and how it works. Prayer is often touted, I think, as about changing us. But I would suggest to you that the Psalms model a kind of prayer that is really about changing God in any given crisis scenario, more than it is about changing us. But in the ways that we're seeing in this psalm, not in any given way, but in the sense that we were talking about a second ago, about calling God to act like God. We're a part of that process, pointing out to God what it would look like for God to be just. Saying, hey God, there's a situation, and what it would look like for you to be the God that you've said that you are is this. You need to relieve this pain, because that would look like justice. And clearly you don't know about it. And that's the kind of vulnerable relationship that God has involved God's self in, which I think is one of the more amazing points that the Psalms have to share with us, that God is so vulnerable as to allow us to suggest what God's own self ought to do about injustice. These have been great observations and questions. Thank you all so much for what you suggested thus far. If it's all right, can we move to talking through the structure of the song a little bit and seeing how it moves together, and more questions and thoughts can completely arise as we go. I've got a couple things to say about how the psalm moves that we've already touched on a little bit, but then just a couple points to make about its theology. And then I'd like to definitely leave room for questions today about how this all works. Which is not something I know, how it all works. But you know what I mean, that we can talk about it together. So, as we saw earlier, the psalm opens clearly in the first person, right? This is one person's prayer, directly to Yahweh. And the first thing this person does, Yahweh, do not in your anger rebuke me. Do not in your wrath discipline me. And this is the sentence order of the Hebrew. The NRSV has it, do not rebuke me in your anger, or do not something in your wrath. They've switched it around a little bit, but the sentence order in the Hebrew draws a lot of focus and emphasis to this middle moment. In your anger, or in your wrath. The point of this clause is an accusation. The psalm comes right out with a direct call out on God that this is a result. This is God's fault. God is to be blamed for what's going on, and the psalmist is not doesn't have second thoughts about this. There's just an inherent claim, and what's not commented on at all is whether or not the psalmist deserves any of this. Do you guys notice that throughout this prayer? There's no confession. There's no saying sorry or saying this or that happened, and I get it. You're just in your actions. But can you please relieve this pain? Like, I get it already. No, there's just a call that God needs to stop this, and that what God is doing in God's anger and God's wrath needs to be done. It needs to be finished. I mean, what boldness, if you really think about it, to pray like that. There's just an inherent validity to this psalmist's experience of the pain, and that seems to be something the psalmist thinks matters to God. It doesn't need to be worked out whether or not it's deserved. The psalmist is just claiming, this needs to end. God, do something about it. Bear responsibility for my life. And this prayer in verse 2, be gracious to me, is something I wanted to point out to us, because I think in the NRSV and other translations, this is often translated, have mercy on me or be merciful to me. Where we see be merciful in the Psalms sometimes means be merciful, but often it means be gracious. And those are actually two very different words in Hebrew. The prayer for grace, which is mentioned again in verse 9, you'll notice this word, my prayer for grace. It's the same word as what's being said in verse 2. Be gracious it means act faithfully toward me. Do something positive. And be merciful means hold back punishment. Don't do something, right? When you ask for mercy, you're asking for someone to withhold what they're going to do that you deserve. When you ask for grace, you ask for someone to give something, whether or not you deserve it. So the psalmist, again, is calling for God to do something about this situation, not calling for God simply to receive or to stop the pain, but to transform it, to change the situation, right? To act on the psalmist's behalf. And the reasoning here, my body shakes, my very being is shaken. I'm so weak. Such bodily problems, such real physical, material expressions of pain and suffering that apparently are the kind of vocabulary that one can use with God. Knowing how to eloquently describe what our problems are is not necessarily the concern of getting God to act on our behalf. And it shouldn't keep us from praying for help. There's a raw, emotional outpouring of what this person's body feels like in this prayer. This is not high theological language. This is literally right there, the words in verse 2, heal me, Yahweh, for my bones are shaking. My bones are out of joint, or something like that. Eczem, but this word really refers to the structure of a body. This person is shaking, and that's what they're telling God about. And the accusation there in verse 3 again, you, Yahweh. And then it just said in Hebrew, it's ad matai. It's just this expression, how long? Why? Come on, act already. Just this raw groan of a cry. Very different from the eloquent poetry of Psalm 104, right? This poetry represents the grunt of being miserable and shaking and not being able to put words together. Turn, Yahweh, save my life for the sake of your commitment. And then this verse that we talked about, this move here in verses 4 through 5, it moves to involve God in the problem. The first couple verses are about telling the problem, I'm in pain, but verses 4 through 5, the move then is to say, and just to be clear, this is on you and it's your problem more than it is mine, because your character is in the balance. I'm one of your faithful. I'm one of your people. And if you abandon me, it's on you. People are going to see it, and it's going to matter to your reputation. So act for the sake of your name, for the sake of how you're known. Show us that you really are what you say you are, what our tradition says you are. Because who cares if you're faithful if I go down to the dust? What difference does it make for me, is what the psalmist is saying. Which I think counters our ideas sometimes about the appropriateness of praise and thanks in the midst of tragedy, which there's a lot of pop Christian wisdom about, I think. The idea that we should be remembering how good God is even when things are bad. Show me where that is in here. This psalmist is clear. Do something. What difference does it make? Your commitment, what does it matter if when things go crisis for me, I'm alone? Show yourself now. It's a very bold cry for God to be God when it matters here. What I wanted to point out to us about verses 6 and 7, which I think do have another shift, some of the most beautiful and, for me, moving verses in the Psalms. These images of tears and soaking wet, tear-ridden bed of this psalmist. Such a lonely image, such a dark image. These verses, you'll notice, don't have direct address of God's name. They don't actually keep saying Yahweh this, Yahweh. Rather, I think it kind of shifts, and you could read it as a continuation of verses 4 and 5, still talking to God, but it's ambiguous. There's almost just sort of a groaning quality to this, that the psalmist is writing to no one, that no one's listening. It's just an expression, I think, it's just the pouring out of the psalmist's current state. It's part of the prayer, and yet it's sort of drifting away from direct address. There's a distancing that's happening. It's sort of losing touch with this unresponsive God. There's an isolation, and this verse 7, is kind of difficult in the modern English, but what this is saying, my eye has wasted away from anger, grown weak because of all my attackers. That parallelism there, those two lines helps us understand what each line means. An eye wasting away from anger here means something like, well, when people's eyes are referenced in the Psalms, it's often eyes that are looking for God's action, eyes that are looking to see what God will do, or eyes that have seen it. And these are those eyes, I think. It's an eye that's waiting for action, and it's wasted away. It's exhausted from anger, and this anger is aggression. It's the aggression of enemies. It's the aggression and anger that is being experienced by the psalmist. The violence, you might say. My eye is wasted away from keeping watch on the violence coming at me without seeing any deliverance coming at me. This is wasting the psalmist away. And their eyes are literally growing dim while keeping guard on themselves and seeing no hope in sight.
So it's a bigger concept than just the fact that all this crime
Right.
made the idea.
I think so. I mean,
Okay.
I think right there. I mean, the Hebrew is clear, believe it or not. But the image in verse 6 is certainly about wasted away through crime, literally. But in verse 7, it turns to this wrath that the psalmist is wasted away from, and for what we can tell from the rest of the psalm, that the wrath and the anger in the psalm is not that of the psalmist, but that of the enemies that they're experiencing. And mostly it's this intertextual move to understand how eyes are often understood in the Psalms. Eyes are not often associated with putting out anger, but for watching for things. So it's a more of a passive body part in that sense, a way of taking in. So we wouldn't associate with the psalmist's own anger. And then you have this final section, which matters so much, and it's tough to understand, I think. But beginning in verse 8, there seems to have been some sign for the psalmist that Yahweh has heard the prayer. And yet, this could also be sort of a way of announcing that Yahweh ought to hear the prayer. But what I'd like to draw our attention to is that we've shifted now into describing Yahweh in the third person. There's no direct address anymore. It's not a groan. It's a description outward to the attackers, right? So there's a further distancing going on, I think. And whether this is a hopeful thing or not, I think it still represents, rhetorically, the experience of the psalmist feeling farther and farther away. And so at one and the same time, in verses 8 through 10, I think we have an expression of total trust and total despair, all bound up in the same lines, which feels contradictory to us, but I think in the experience of suffering, trust at the end of the day often can only look like total despair. And I think that the psalmist is able to trust by entrusting God with total despair. The psalmist doesn't have to keep proclaiming just how sure they are about this. Rather, they announce it, that God will act this way. And I think, in that sense, pull God into the fray. Announce to their attackers, this is who God will be. It follows on the logic of the earlier verses. The hope of this psalmist is that God's character will end up being God's character. And it's up to God now to decide whether God will live up to God's name and what God is known for. So, on that note, before we move to just a couple questions, I just wanted to share like one or two theological observations about the psalm, and then we can discuss it. First of all, I think the psalm calls us to be attentive to those who are socially isolated, and not just those who are suffering in ways that are visible. This psalm, I think, is the voice of a person who is lonely and who people are repelled by for whatever reason. There's the words "heal me," which seems to suggest maybe even physical illness or something that probably wasn't all that acceptable in their social circles. But these verses in 6 through 7 especially just are clearly about being alone, and not having anyone to look to. And so I think that the psalm in that way challenges our notions about the us and them in the Psalms, enemies, and who might be doing this isolation. We often, I think, read the Psalms and think, oh, enemies, those people that are obviously my enemies, those people I don't talk to and will never see again, who just are pure evil, and that classic us and the other, right, the full other. This is a psalm that's taking place in a religious community. I mean, this person belongs to a village or a family or a small community that gathers in the same religious space every week and prays to the same God. So this psalmist is in all likelihood praying against people they know well and will continue to know. There's a validation here, I think, about what it's really like to live in community and what it can really be like to feel abandoned by those we trust or who were our friends or who may be our friends yet again, but right now have left us alone. So alone that we feel crazy about whether we are alone or not, or depressed. This is a very common occurrence in communities for people to feel isolated and not to know how to bring that to the table. This gives voice to that kind of experience, and it doesn't hesitate to call these enemies and to wish for their shame and to entrust God with that. As we'll see next week when we look at a psalm of thanksgiving, God acts in response to prayer, often in a way that announces for one person in community that God's acted on their behalf. And this creates a very interesting political situation for those people who are perhaps the oppressors in a psalm like Psalm 6. It pulls a community into the fray about who's been left alone and who hasn't. That said, I would just say when we read these psalms, we should think about whose voice this really might be, and we should think about whose voice it might be in our own communities. If it's our own, we should think about how this voice is shared across our community by others, or that it might be possible in our community to pray this prayer. I think often we see this and we think, wow, somebody in total isolation, that's terrible, but it really could be, this is what community life looks like. This is the canonized Psalms. It's not a marginal situation that's obvious all the time. This is an invisible kind of pain. I think this encourages us to look for that kind of pain in our communities and to be aware of it and not to leave people alone, to put it simply. And that said, I wanted to point out to us that I think this psalm and other psalms of lament point out that our faith is one that's hospitable to unresolved despair. And when I contrast this with the frequent presentation of Christianity, I think that Christians should be joyful all the time, or thankful all the time, or hopeful all the time, or that our life of prayer needs to be happy and nice and good and universal, rather than drawing lines like these are my friends and these are my enemies. Instead, I think our life of prayer and community makes a home for our pain and for the pain of others. And I think the most desperate need in our society is not the resolution of pain or its explanation, but rather its acknowledgement. And I think that the Psalms of Lament offer that. They create a space for pain to truly be acknowledged and taken seriously. And they leave it unresolved in many cases. So I want to suggest on that score that it's really not truly Christian to move too quickly to resolve someone's pain or hopelessness in a community. And that if we think that being Christian is about resolving pain all the time, then we've oversimplified what it means to participate in the gospel. I think that we are a community that is confident and secure enough to tell the truth about pain, that it is unresolved often. And that is what we offer most of all, not a place where your pain will be solved, which is offered, I think, on every corner from a whole lot of different sources in our society, a place to get away from the pain, but rather a place where it will be validated and taken seriously. So those are a couple thoughts. I'd love to hear your questions and remarks on what's been said or what's stood out to you this time.
So with regard to unresolved pain, I mean, when you look around, isn't it really that most of the time it's not going to go away? is unresolved, and it's just.
Yes, right. Yeah, I think so, and I think for this psalmist, I think what stands out to me about this song is the main problem, at least, that stands out to me from this song, for this song, is not even the sickness, but the isolation. Whatever the sickness is, the problem here is that people have left this psalmist alone in their pain. And what's being called for, in verse 8, depart from me, all you who cause sorrow. Yahweh has heard, right? Yahweh has received. There's an announcement about Yahweh listening to the sound of my weeping. I mean, the proclamation about God is not even that Yahweh has healed me. It's that Yahweh has listened to my crying, right? There's something that Yahweh offers here that the community is not offering. A place for the tears to be received, for the grief not to be repulsive, or for the sickness not to be. So what the psalmist finds in Yahweh is an ear, a person to be with the psalmist in their pain. I don't think it's necessarily implied that God doesn't act for the psalmist or heal them, but what stands out to me is that the main problem here is this isolatedness. That's the kind of death, I think, that the psalmist is really wrestling with, more than actually going to the grave. Don't let me be cut off from the living. Let my wife continue to be alive and full of color.
It seems interesting. You mentioned that it's part of a community, and
Right.
that the way that the writer wants this solved is like for them to be shamed, which implies to me like a revelation of what they've done.
Yes,
Give them like
absolutely. Yeah,
so that they can then acknowledge it.
completely. I think that's dead on. I think what's being prayed for here is vindication, and resolution, not quiet healing, but restore my life, which would mean set things right again, which would mean processing what's gone down, which would mean processing the isolatedness that has taken place and the abandonment that happened on the part of perhaps friends or family or whoever. But the point is, resolve this fully, and to cause those who shame me to be ashamed. Let them shake. And I don't think that's just a call for meaningless pain. I think you're right. It's a call for a particular kind of shame. The resolution of this evil, this abandonment that has gone down. And this will be really important next week in the psalm we look at. But we'll leave it there for now.
Are you gonna tell us what number it
Yeah, totally. I will.
is? The foreign.
Go ahead.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah.
Gretchen came up with a book from her vast store, Reflections on the Psalms by C.S. Lewis, published in 1958.
Yeah, right.
It's I read a little bit of it. It's organized around themes, and the first theme that he talks about is the theme of judgment, God's judgment. So, and he said something I found really fascinating. Injustice was just really rampant in that ancient world or whatever. People, the strong to advantage of the weak, constantly. I mean, say, a woman whose husband had died and sons had been killed, and they were all farmers, whatever. So if you got a poor widow with no sons or whatever, and the husband was gone, and she got this farmland, well, her neighbors would encroach on that, take it over, and she was powerless for anything of that, and that was just the so. So C.S. Lewis's comment was that a Jew thinking about they were all Jews, a Jew thinking about the theme of judgment would hope for, he would see Judgment Day as a civil court proceeding in which he is the plaintiff. Somebody has done him wrong or her wrong, and he is hoping that his case will be judged and he will be found to be in the right. And he will be awarded heavy damages.
Right.
Whereas a Christian thinks of it as a criminal court proceeding. A Christian person knows of his own sins. And when it comes to he sees Judgment Day as a criminal case with himself standing as the accused and hoping for pardon. It's a very different view, you know,
Right.
of judgment. I just
That's
thought
right,
that was
yeah.
fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, and one of the things that separates, I think, a lot of modern Christian spirituality from the spirituality of the Psalms that we would, I think, do well to recover from the Psalms is that they seem to assume that we can come to prayer without apologizing. There's a lot of first letting God know that we suck in Christian spirituality.
Yeah.
There really is. And the Psalms don't come with that notion very often, actually. Very few times in the Psalter is sin confessed, or sin even brought up. A lot in the Psalter, help is demanded. And there's an assumption that God's people are God's people, and that God is bound to them. There's a place for that, for sin, or for... It's assumed, it's part of the relationship, and it's not so front and center for the Psalms as it is in Christian spirituality as often. That's empowering. We can ask for help without worrying to clean the slate first, or something like that. Because God is God, and God can handle it. And God's got bigger problems than us and our sins. Sorry, that was putting it too short. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, these are the problems that God is willing to work with, and God apparently will act without us being all right and good first. Any other questions or thoughts before we go? We have a couple minutes.
Well, you've helped me with the word enemies. I mean, always in Psalms, enemies. First thing comes to my mind are marauding armies with swords and all that. Well, of course, then I realize, I say, okay, it's not just that, but
Right.
gee, and then try to figure that out.
Right. No, it's not. Yeah.
It's keeping your pew sitters.
Right. And this is entrusted, again, to God. The determination of enemies and their future is left to God in this psalm. And that's so worth emphasizing. The Psalms, we can almost describe them as the most pacifist book in the Bible. Because as much violence as they contain, the prayers are left over to God. It's such a deeply, I don't want to use the word pacifist to make that determine the Psalms' ideology, but rather it's a deeply peacemaking way of prayer, to pray our hatreds into God and to give God our desire for violence, which is real, that we desire it and that we want it and we wrestle with it as a solution to problems, as a solution to enemies and those who cause sorrow. It's a real and just desire, and God makes a place for it, but the goodness of the posture that the Psalms call us into is that as Christians, or as people of this God, we are able to trust God with that, to do what God will with it, rather than taking it upon ourselves or asking for God to bless our efforts to solve those problems of enemies. A hard thing to live by, I think, to leave it up to God to solve those problems. But it calls us to a particular kind of peacemaking that yet still has room for those inclinations and for those needs that we have, I think, in communities to see a particular kind of justice done. That we long for, but we don't always get to see. God has a place for those parts of us and that spectrum of our emotions. Thank you all so much for your comments. We will next week go to Psalm 30, which will be another shift in the kind of speech we're looking at. But we'll keep lament in the air and we'll keep talking about it as we talk about that, which is a Psalm of Thanksgiving. It's what it's been called.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.